I hope everyone is enjoying your lunch. We thought we would break up the program and have a little bit of fun. At least it'll be fun for me, because talking to Mike Mussallem is special. Edwards Lifesciences is one of the really singular success stories in our industry during the past generation, and it's really been the story of Mike and Mike's leadership. He's an entrepreneur of a special kind. Most entrepreneurs that we know, we think of the classic model of venture capital startup, but Mike came from a big company and took a division of that company and made it into something entirely different, and something that I think that Baxter had never envisioned exactly. But why don't we start with that, Mike, in terms of how you came to spin off Edwards from Baxter, and what kind of vision you had at the beginning of doing that.
Well, thanks, David. First of all, your comments are very generous. I don't know, I always look at what's going on with us as a work in process. Yeah, I had worked for Baxter for about 20 years, kind of grown up in Baxter, if you will, and sort of one of those guys, if you got something done, they gave you more to do, and so I kept getting more to do, and ultimately I had responsibility for this business plus a few other things in Baxter, the biopharmaceutical business in Asia. And we were going through a strategy planning process and saying, my gosh, how could you be in the cardiovascular device business in the 90s and not be growing? It was hard to do because everybody else in the space was growing fast. And it didn't take a whole lot of analysis to come to the realization that the innovation had stopped. And that's really where the juice came from. And so we said, you know, we have to change something seriously if we're going to get the innovation back and get the growth back. And so we considered, gee, should we buy another cardiovascular company and put Edwards underneath it, or should there just be a timeout from contributing to the earnings growth of Baxter and just pour money back into the cardiovascular business for a while? But ultimately the decision was better to just spin it off. Baxter had some success with that. It was a tax-free transaction to shareholders, and it seemed to make good financial sense to the bankers, and I raised my hand and said, that would be fun. And you know, with the belief that we had some good values, we had some leading market positions, but this was just about getting a group that was probably excited to be turned loose to some extent, and give them the charter to go out and let's innovate, let's change, let's take some risk, let's go make something happen. And it didn't take a lot of convincing. Our gang was ready to go, and Wall Street was actually very forgiving along the way as well.
So that's interesting. If we look back at that period in history, there were other pharmaceutical companies that divested themselves or spun off medical device businesses. Lilly spun out Guidant. Pfizer spun out its medical device business. How did you view the opportunity to unlock value compared to what Baxter was able to extract from that division?
Well, you know, we had the good fortune that there was only one place to go, and that was up. The gross profit wasn't that great. The growth rate wasn't that great. You know, the Baxter, growth rate popped up as soon as they spun us out as well, because you sort of lost one of the anchors. And they also gave us a parting gift of some debt. And so we were in a position that, you know, we could just pay the bills and probably become more valuable. But we really did have this belief that we could, why not us? Why couldn't we innovate? Why couldn't we change? And as I said, there was a real desire amongst that team that they wanted to make something happen. And you know, part of this was also just deciding that we were going to take on the portfolio and get out of some things that didn't have a bright future, so that we could sort of move some bets to some things that had some possibilities.
You know, you talk about the debt, and the analyst, when the IPO first floated, mentioned that. Everybody underscored it. But there were undoubtedly other obstacles. What were the obstacles to your vision, or the obstacles to growth that you first encountered and then encountered perhaps in the second round?
Well, there were a number of things. One was just sort of where we put our energy. We probably put more energy into the portions of the company that weren't contributing a great deal of value, places where the customer didn't reward us very much and it had very high expectations, and other places where we added great value, where it was almost easy and it didn't get the attention it deserved. So some of that was just recasting that. Part of it was trying to help all the folks in the company take on some risk. There was, we had sort of beaten the risk-taking out of people through our experience in a large company. People would try something and, inevitably it didn't go according to plan, and, no one wanted to fess up to that because it wasn't going so great, and so it stayed underground until it got to be a really big problem, and then it got discovered, and then we'd have a public hanging. And so it encouraged those come after not to take risks, and things became very incremental. And part of what we had to convince people is, well-intended, thoughtful risks were something we're not going to be punished, actually. They're going to be acknowledged. We're going to say it's okay, when it's the right kind of mistake. And a matter of fact, we're going to acknowledge it and allow people to just course correct through that. And it took a while before people believed it, but ultimately we got there.
So part of what you're describing is a culture change. I mean, you changed the way that people thought about risk-taking, for example. Mm-hmm. What did that mean in terms of team? In other words, what came over with you and what did you need to build?
Yeah, a number of people sort of self-selected into that environment because there was a certain amount of risk. If you were comfortable inside a big company, you tended to want to stay in that environment, and we encouraged people to do that because there was going to be much more exposure and much more risk being within an Edwards. One of the speeches that we gave the people is, given that we were so much smaller in Baxter, today you are 10 times more important to this company than you were yesterday. And if you have a really good year or a really bad year, we're going to notice, right? And it's going to be noticeable externally. And certain people were up for that and others just weren't. And so we ended up with self-selection. The team turned over to some extent, and sort of like-minded people came together.
So when we talk about entrepreneurial companies in our space, and certainly in any high-tech area, we talk about incentive compensation, we talk about stock and so forth. How did you handle that? Were you able to act in an entrepreneurial way in terms of ownership of the company?
Yeah, we really put a premium on that. That was a time when the venture-backed small companies, if you were a bright leader or a bright engineer or a bright scientist, there was a lot of money to be made, and you weren't so sure that you wanted to be inside a big company. You'd rather go after that opportunity, which allowed you to potentially accumulate a great deal of wealth. And so we put a lot of energy into stock ownership. We really asked people to behave like owners, not like employees, and we put stock in the hands of every single person and tried to especially load up the folks that had the greatest influence with the idea that if we made something happen, it was going to be meaningful to you and make a difference. And so that was an important step for us. We also became students to some extent of what happens in the small companies. We know that the small companies innovate so much better than the large ones. We say, how the heck does that happen? And it had a lot to do with, compensation to some extent, because, if you were successful, you were very wealthy, and if you were unsuccessful, you were out of work. And you don't have those same kind of equations inside big companies. If you're not so successful, you might go to another project. And you also learn something about earning your way to success, right? You hit a milestone, you get rewarded, and you get the money to go after the next milestone, not annual budgets and the kind of things we did things in big companies. And so we tried to learn from that and try and incorporate some of that kind of thinking into Edwards.
So Edwards' ticker symbol, if you don't know, is EW, and if you want to see the narrative of this, just plug that into Google Finance and look at the performance of EW from the IPO till today, and it's a remarkable story. Right now, in fact, congratulations, because you've just had a fantastic FDA clearance on a project that's been running for a long time. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the vision for the transcatheter heart valve, the path to clearance, which has not been without drama and angst on the way.
Yeah, we are so pumped. Just yesterday, after the market closed, the FDA sent us a letter and simultaneously sent it to everybody else in the universe that our product was finally approved, which is a big thrill for us. This has been a long and winding road. I think for those folks that think it's an overnight success, they'd be interested to know that we started on this the first time, I think back in '99, working on it. We did an acquisition in 2004 of somebody that was actually slightly ahead of us, but we thought we had an inferior product. But we sort of got caught up in this. You have to picture, here's a company who's the leader in surgical heart valves, and here is this disruptive therapy to be able to replace heart valves without open heart surgery. So our number one most important customer would end up threatened if this new technology worked. And we had read the work by Clayton Christensen that said that the market leaders are unlikely to innovate, and we decided that we were going to try and be the ones that broke the rules on that one. And so we went after this, and we went after it with a lot of passion. We walled off a team. We tried to put our very best people in that team, both the folks that we acquired. We nurtured them. We took best people from inside the company and embedded them in the team, and we gave them a lot of funding. We let them go, and we let them go without really being influenced by our core heart valve business. And we got a lot of support from our board along the way, and we moved forward with the technology. The early stage of the technology, although it was pretty spectacular, they only allowed patients to be operated on that were extraordinarily sick, literally had weeks or at most a month to live. And so there was a successful physician in Paris, it was Alain Cribier, who did this, but once we decided that we wanted to start commercializing and putting it in the hands of others, we found that others just did not have success. We had deaths along the way, and we actually stopped our U.S. feasibility trial in 2005. And it wasn't looking very good about that time. There was a bright cardiologist in Canada who had this idea about a totally different approach coming up on the arterial side rather than the venous side. We were able to explore that. That looked good, and it started a whole new chapter. But very, very cautious FDA. We had a chance to live out this world that we all live in together, which is, here's a very important therapy, that this is one of those special ones that looks like it improves mortality, it's more cost effective, and it improves quality of life. And you just don't get three firsts very often. And this is one of those. And we tried to play it out in an extraordinarily high quality way, always being very transparent, open, lots of data, lots of clinical trials. Long story short, approved in Europe in 2007. We got our CE mark, and we went into the largest randomized trial ever in heart valve surgery. Actually, there were no randomized trials in heart valve surgery, and we've just made our way through that. Actually, the results were published a little more than a year ago in New England Journal of Medicine. That called it a new standard of care for these inoperable patients, and that was what was approved here yesterday for the first group of these patients. But we get to see it illustrated here 4 years after Europe, and I want to say, we laugh that we have a chant on campus. We're number 43 because it's the 43rd country in the world to approve transcatheter heart valves.
Well, that comment sort of takes us into a different direction, which has been a second part of your career, because not only have you been an entrepreneur and a CEO leader in developing Edwards Lifesciences, but going back, at least, 7 years ago or so, you became more and more involved in public policy and on the external and political side of our industry. I know you joined the CHI board in, about 1999, and became our chairman for a couple of years, and then moved on to become the chairman of AdvaMed. How did you envision that part of your career, particularly as you were quite busy building a high-velocity, high-growth company?
Well, with the first few years of Edwards, I really didn't do much externally. I tried to be very careful about that because it just consumed so much energy inside the company. But once we got our feet underneath us, But there were two things that drove me. One is just this industry has been so good to me personally, and the opportunity to try and give back in my own way and try and help public policy be rational for the rest of us is something that I welcome doing. And also, it became apparent that the public policy side of managing companies was taking a more important role than ever. I mean, you could run a great company inside your four walls, if you were, or just your relationships with customers, but still fall short because you weren't able to adequately navigate through the highly regulated climate that we all operated in. So I felt like I wanted to spend more time in that arena, not only to help Edwards be successful and give me insight, but also just to make the world a little better, if I could, for innovation.
Well, as an accident of history, perhaps, or maybe not an accident, you landed at AdvaMed square in the middle of healthcare reform. And that had to have been a remarkable experience. Maybe you could share a few anecdotes or reflections in terms of what was, I think, a very complicated and fraught process.
Yeah, it was. It's certainly something that I didn't anticipate, that our new president was going to come in and decide that he wanted to reform the healthcare system, and it changed everything. It went from a job that I thought was going to maybe take 5 or 10% of my time to something that consumed over half of my time. You know, the first exposure to it was a call that came in on a Friday, said, could you please be in the White House on Monday and don't tell anybody? And so it came, and there was a meeting and a challenge thrown out by the president. Let's bend the cost curve. We need to take $2 trillion out of this thing over the next 10 years. Are you with me or not? Right? And around the table were the insurance companies and pharma and the hospitals and the physicians and the unions, et cetera. And you know, I'm not sure we knew exactly what we were getting into. It was kind of like, well, yeah, I guess. And next thing you know, we were behind the president as he was giving his speech kicking off healthcare reform. And, you know, it was an interesting time because not only it was, well, I'll just put it this way, it was a heck of an education. And for me, somebody that had spent, 25 years of my life in this field, I realized how little I knew about the total healthcare system. It is very large, it's very complex, it looks very differently depending on where you stand inside this system. If you're a physician, or if you're a patient, or if you're an insurer, or if you're a pharmaceutical company, you name it, it looks very different. And trying to open your mind enough to understand how you could try and have our own industry prosper at the same time you had a system that made sense was very different for me to learn about. And then at the same time that we were trying to negotiate with the external forces, we had a lot of negotiation going on inside the industry, as you might imagine. We're a pretty diverse industry, the medical device space, because you did everything from hair nets to MRI machines and everything in between. And to have those companies come and converge on a common position was no small task. We had a tremendous number of board meetings and heart-to-hearts and one-on-ones and so forth to try and get ourselves to a common position and really ask for everybody's cooperation for the most part to see if we could get in a common position, because that's where it all started. If you didn't have a common position, there was no way you were going to be able to deliver it once you got outside of our own circle.
So now we see healthcare reform partly through the prism of the most recent election. And I wonder, knowing what you know now, you talk about the lessons that you've learned and the education that you got in the process. Knowing what you know now, if you could go back in a time machine, would you do something differently?
That's a good question. I probably don't reflect on that very much because at that time we felt pretty constrained. You had to trust a lot of people about what was possible and what could be accomplished. There was a certain political reality and there was a certain time frame that existed back then. You had a brand new president that was extraordinarily popular. You had a solid Democratic House and Senate, and so you had a set of dynamics that rarely exist in history, and the president knew this, and he really wanted to get this done, and he knew he needed to get it done in the first year, otherwise politically it probably wouldn't happen. So there was a tremendous amount of energy and force going in that direction, and I don't know if we could have done, you know, much more to really change the way that developed. You know, it's a
No, I think
it was a unique point in time.
It's interesting. Someone made a comment earlier in the meeting today with respect to the pharma deal, in which pharma, in effect, accepted a large tax. But the comment was, you know, if we had known that at the time and knew that that would just be the table stakes and that the price of poker would go up a lot afterward, maybe we would have had a different view. I think some of the former pharma board members had that view as well. Of course, there isn't any time machine, and there isn't any ability to change the past. But it's interesting to try to understand.
It is, and it was, you know, it was obviously driven by a certain ideology along the way, and there were broad goals going in. I told a story about the very first challenge was how we're going to take cost out of the system, but when it was all done, you know, if out of the three prongs that were hoped for out of healthcare reform, to do something about the rising cost of healthcare that was untenable, to do something about quality, which has been viewed by everybody as uneven, and to do something about the lack of access for these 40, 50 million Americans. Those were the goals, and probably access got handled pretty well, but quality and cost, you'd argue, you wonder whether there was much progress made there. And so we sort of dragged it, you know, the big we dragged it across the finish line with what was politically possible at the time. And, you know, we still have some big issues out there related to quality and cost.
So within the medical device industry, just to take that as a separate topic, we all know that there have been press reports of quality and safety problems with some devices. There is, to some degree at the FDA, and certainly to a large degree in the mainstream media, a view that the industry is not as focused on safety and doesn't have as many safety mechanisms as perhaps it should. Do you have a view on whether there should be changes or whether there are ways for companies to be more progressive in this regard?
You know, I believe that it's really important for us to try and deliver wonderful products, and maybe there was a certain amount of complacency in the past, but you know, any mistakes that are made by the industry, and they became more apparent over time. They were sort of behind the scenes, if you go back to the 90s or earlier. But you know, this idea that there was some kind of a failure rate on devices, even if it was small, and these failures could be serious. As this got exposed and it ended up on the front page of newspapers and therefore driven by the Congress, this drove a great deal of concern. And when you couple that with the idea that, gee, was there something else unseemly going on because of the payments that people could track between companies and physicians who were spending the money that was really taxpayer money and so forth, it led to a feeling of mistrust of the industry. And even though we all know it's not fair, right, there may be a few bad examples out there that are appropriate to look at, it caused there to be a real change in the regulatory climate. My belief is we do need to up our game. You know, I think the voluntary standards that we all adopt, and we found all the best companies have all adopted voluntary standards of improving what we do across the board, have been important, but there's still this level of mistrust that exists out there, and it's part of what's driving you know, what our disappointment is today, which is a system that moves slow and in a system that begrudgingly, you know, parts with any payments or approvals.
Well, in thinking about payments and approvals, so you've gotten the transcatheter heart valve through the FDA, but just as it was coming through, the CMS initiated a national coverage decision prospectively. which is, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's the first time that this has happened. How do you view that, and give us some context for how to think about this?
Sure. You can imagine we tried to retain some of the best reimbursement minds around to help us, get through the process and the CMS process. And what we learned along the way is that what was most likely is that we would have our procedures covered under local coverage determination. So the procedures that we were doing could be covered generally under open heart surgery of replacing heart valves, and people were just being paid under those DRGs during the course of the clinical trials, and that was being done locally. There were 20 centers, diverse centers across the country. And the belief was that once the procedure was approved and there was, say, maybe a couple of years of history, that there would be a national coverage analysis that would be opened, would study the costs in the system, and a unique DRG would be created for this therapy. Our little niche of heart valves, which we thought would live in some small corner of the healthcare world and always did in the past, it sort of took on some kind of a size that surprised us and got the attention of a lot of policymakers and certainly of the societies that were going to be engaged in the practice of this medicine. And what it caused CMS to do is actually open this national coverage determination even before the product was approved by FDA, and I'm not aware of any others that have gone through that process. Now, if the process goes well and they do the things that are fair and it's consistent with what was studied in the clinical trial, that should all be fine. It's sort of, I think it's caused people to say, boy, if they went this early, that probably means they're going to put a lid on it. And so that's what's caused a certain amount of turbulence around, how big is this opportunity? Does CMS have some kind of plan in mind to keep it smaller, right?
Right. During the earlier part of the day, in a couple of different conversations, there was a lot of talk about the importance of value in medical technology innovation and of being able to provide analysis or provide metrics, if you will, around value. How do you think about that at Edwards, and maybe with the example of the heart valve?
Yeah, I think the heart valve's a good example. I think our belief is that you really need to generate high quality evidence if you want to increase your odds of being paid for the procedure. And so in our case, as part of the clinical trial, right alongside, we had external experts, in our case it was HCRI, the Hartford Clinical Research Institute, that did a quality of life analysis of both groups that were randomized in the trial and a cost effectiveness. And so a real comparison of these randomized groups so that you had this data that could be externally examined, that had a certain amount of credibility, that really spoke to those issues, in addition to what the FDA was interested in, which was tell us about mortality, and that's not so important to the payers by comparison. So we found that we needed to do this work, and we believe that by doing the work, and it's a little tough when you go in because there's a certain amount of trust that you have to have that the data's going to turn out okay to go through all this, but it leads you to believe that you'll be successful. But it's, just backing that up, what that says to probably many of the people in this audience is that you want to know enough about your procedure before you go generate that kind of evidence. So therefore, that experience that you get in Europe so that you can learn and know enough about what you're doing before you come and get into these rigorous trials becomes important, and therefore the length of time and the amount of money that you spend along the way just gets to be more money and more time. But that's probably, at least our view, if you really want to open up these large markets, it's the price of admission.
Well, I want to thank you, Mike, for sharing some of your thoughts with us. I mean, I think everyone in the room is interested in the principles of innovation, entrepreneurship, how you built a great company. So thank you.